Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be doing a ranking of every film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe up this point, which is directly after Phase 3. Now I'm doing this right before the start of Phase 4 of the MCU. The MCU as a series is just something that I have so much respect for. And for this video, we'll obviously be ranking every film so far. So there are 23 movies to be going over here. Again, these are just my personal opinions, obviously. If you don't agree with my ranking, then oh well. But I just thought this would be a fun thing to do right before Black Widow comes out. So let's just get started with the ranking. Starting off the ranking here with number 23, we have a movie that I know some people really like. I know this movie kind of has like a cult following at this point. And I tried to rewatch it, and for me, it still just didn't stick. And for me, that is The Incredible Hulk. And I will fully admit, I think this is probably a better movie than the next, probably 2 or 3 movies we'll be talking about on the list. Like, I don't think this is a bad movie by any means. I just don't love it as an MCU film. To me, it just feels it feels weird. It feels so disconnected from the other films. A lot of that obviously being due to the fact that Ed Norton plays the Incredible Hulk here instead of Mark Ruffalo like in the rest of the MCU. So because of that kind of feels disconnected. I also feel like it just feels unimportant for the most part to the rest of the MCU. Again, it is a decent movie. It's well acted. It's decently written. But on the rewatch, I just really didn't connect to it. I was really hoping to actually put it a bit higher because, again, it is a movie that I know a lot of other people really respect nowadays. But for me, didn't really connect for me. It's still here at number 23. At number 22, I have Iron Man 2. And this is actually a movie that I didn't watch when it initially came out. I actually didn't watch it until after I had watched Iron Man 3. And Iron Man 2 is just kind of eh. It's another one that's like in kind of a weird spot with the MCU where it feels more so like a sequel to the first Iron Man than it does feel like a part of the series as a whole. It doesn't feel like at this point they were like fully committed to this massive universe that obviously the MCU ends up being. And then also, it's just not that good of a movie. I mean, it really is. I mean, as a sequel to the first Iron Man, it is a bit of a letdown. It feels like a movie that's trying to mimic the success that they had with the first Iron Man, and in doing so, they don't really get it right. That being said, Tony Stark is still Tony Stark. I really love Tony Stark as a character. Sam Rockwell's in this movie. That's cool. But overall, kind of just a mediocre movie. Lands here at number 22. At number 21 is another pretty mediocre MCU film, and that is Thor: The Dark World. The problem with Thor: The Dark World is that it's just not a good movie. And again, like as part of the MCU, I do feel like it's a bit more of an important film than something like Iron Man 2 and The Incredible Hulk, and that's why it is above those other movies. But as a movie on its own right, it's just not that good. I mean, the villain is probably one of the most boring villains in the entire series. And again, that is obviously a problem with the MCU in general, especially earlier on, is that the villains were, for the most part, pretty weak. They were kind of just backdrops where the heroes were kind of the more important figures within the films, making the villains just a lot less important. But here in Thor: The Dark World, I mean, like, who is Malekith? I mean, like, he's so boring. Like, what a terrible villain. But, I mean, at the end of the day, this is a somewhat important film to the overall Infinity War saga. Obviously, this does introduce one of the Infinity Stones. And for me, I personally like Thor as a character, so that's kind of what's keeping it out of the very bottom. But to be honest, as a movie on its own right, it probably is the worst MCU film. To be honest, most of it is just straight up boring. But now for number 20, I have Captain America: The First Avenger. And this is a movie I've never really liked. I mean, I remember when I first watched this movie, I just found it so dull. I do think in retrospect, I have more respect for it than I did initially. Obviously, seeing the beginning of Captain America's story is really great. It is a massive departure from a lot of the other MCU films, obviously taking place during World War II, which is obviously a much different setting than we're usually used to in the other MCU films. And obviously, this film does also act as a lead-in to the Avengers, which is obviously a massively important film in the overall MCU. And there is a lot of really cool connective tissue that comes from the first Avenger here. But as a film, again, it's just one that I don't really love. Even when rewatching it, I just feel like it's fine. Like, it's an okay movie. It's not bad. It's not overly good either. Like, it's fine. But because of all this connective tissue to the rest of the MCU, I do think it's good enough to land here at number 20. Now, at number 19, I have Doctor Strange. And I've never cared for Doctor Strange either. I do think that something that this film does have over some of these other ones that we've already talked about is I do think as time has gone on, obviously the MCU has more of an identity at this point, and I think Doctor Strange better utilizes the identity of the MCU, obviously with its style of humor, its style of storytelling, and that is something that I do enjoy here, that more so than something like Thor: The Dark World or Iron Man 2 or Incredible Hulk. But I still don't love the movie as a whole. I mean, I do find a good chunk of it pretty boring. It is the origin story of Doctor Strange. That's cool, I guess. I like Doctor Strange as a character. I just don't think he was given a good movie. Obviously, the Time Stone is introduced here, so that's something that's very important. Obviously, Doctor Strange as a figure in the series is very important. But I do feel like a lot of the other stuff that happens within this origin story doesn't really have that much of impact on the rest of the series. And again, overall as a movie, it's not one that I overly enjoyed, so I didn't really feel like it was worth putting any higher than at number 19 here. Now, number 18, I have a movie that I really debated on because I did rewatch this recently, and the first time I watched it, I really didn't care for it. On the rewatch, I kind of still have almost the same opinion, and that is Ant-Man and the Wasp. And I really like the first Ant-Man. Obviously, we'll talk about that a bit later. But for Ant-Man and the Wasp, I just felt like it was kind of just a clone of itself. And for me, it doesn't really hit. Obviously, we do get the introduction to the Wasp, as you would assume. I did like how we got a lot of introduction to the quantum realm sort of stuff in this movie. Again, that obviously becomes important in Avengers Endgame. So that's cool. But outside of that, I do feel like this film felt largely unimportant. Again, a lot of that had to do with the fact that this came out after Infinity War, but took place before it, which is something I didn't love. That being said, this is still an Ant-Man movie, so I did enjoy it a lot more than the other movies that are lower on the list. Again, I still think the humor is still there. I think it's pretty fun. Like, for me, it's just an overly average movie on almost every aspect. Like, I don't think it does anything actively bad, but there's very little that it does, like, mind-blowingly great. So for me, it lands here at number 18. At number 17, we have a movie that is another one that I didn't really care for when I initially watched it, and that is Spider-Man Homecoming. And I will fully admit, I don't love Spider-Man in the MCU. I mean, like, he's fine. I think Tom Holland is a good performer. I think he's good as Spider-Man. And I like Spider-Man when he's in, like, Civil War and Infinity War and Endgame. But as a part of his own standalone films, I don't necessarily love them. I don't feel like he interests me as, like, the main character of a story. But, I mean, Homecoming here, it was fine. I think, like, again, a lot of this obviously focuses on the, like, high school sort of drama with Spider-Man. And that stuff's kind of fine. I just felt like we've seen it before. With, not necessarily with just Spider-Man, with, like, many other films in other sort of genres as well. But it was just, like, kind of mixing that in with superhero stuff. Like, it was fine. I mean, it was fine. I thought Michael Keaton was a decent villain in this movie. I thought that was alright. But it's like, outside of that, I mean, it was just kind of fine. I mean, Tony Stark was in this movie. That's cool. I think Marissa Tomei as, like, Aunt May is pretty good. I think Ned is a pretty fun character. I will admit, though, I never really liked MJ in these films. I mean, we'll obviously talk about more with the sequel to this movie. But MJ is just, I don't like her portrayal in this series. But again, overall, though, Homecoming is fine. It's here at number 17. At number 16, we have Spider-Man Far From Home. We have the next movie in the Spider-Man series. And I like this one more. I mean, I like this one from an aspect that at least it tells a different sort of story. Obviously, here of Spider-Man going on a road trip around Europe, which is just kind of weird, but I thought that brought a different dynamic to Spider-Man. I did like what they did with Mysterio in this movie. I thought Jake Gyllenhaal was fantastic as Mysterio. I did like that Nick Fury was obviously a major figure in this film. I mean, I guess technically not the real Nick Fury, but it's still Samuel L. Jackson, so whatever. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I don't love MJ in this series. I think obviously she is a much, much more prominent figure in this film where she's the main love interest, and a lot of the movie revolves around Peter trying to get with MJ and that sort of stuff. And it's like, I feel like it's a character that's trying to be too cool and too edgy, and it's just a character I don't really like the portrayal of, but it is what it is. But overall, though, I did really enjoy this movie. Again, like, I feel like it takes a different spin on Spider-Man, and I think it's a great sort of pseudo sequel to Endgame, where obviously we see what happens to Spider-Man after Endgame and what happens to this world after Endgame. But also we get to see where the series is moving forward from this point on. So I thought because of that, this was a pretty fun, like, transitional film in the MCU. But at the end of the day, there's just other movies I like more. It ranks here at number 16. Now at number 15, we have another more recent MCU film, and that is Captain Marvel. And I was actually surprised at how much I liked Captain Marvel. I came into it expecting to really look at it as a pretty mediocre film. I was expecting for it to probably rank around where, like, Doctor Strange is. but I ended up enjoying it a lot more. I thought it was a pretty fun take on this like hero's return home, where obviously we do get the origin story of Captain Marvel through this, but most of that's flashbacks. But a lot of this movie takes place with Captain Marvel after she returns to Earth. And obviously there's a lot of like space opera sort of stuff involved with this as well. I just thought it was a fun film. I really like how they connected this with some other films in the series, with like Rowan the Accuser being a character in here, and the Tesseract being involved, and obviously Nick Fury and Phil Coulson being in the movie. And overall, like, again, I liked what they did with this movie. I think Brie Larson is fantastic as Captain Marvel. I think it was a great setup for the character of Captain Marvel. And again, I think it's a good movie. Nothing like mind-blowingly great within this film, but it has a lot of cool things. It's a lot of fun. It ranks here at number 15. Now at number 14, I have a movie that I really debated on where to place this. I want to put it higher because as a movie, I enjoy it so much more than number 14. But as an MCU film, it misses the mark, and that is Iron Man 3. And I like this movie. I really like this movie. As a movie, like just solely as a movie, it's my favorite Iron Man film. But as a piece of the MCU, it's terrible. I mean, it really is. Like, it's a movie that's so disconnected from the rest of the film. They do things with this movie that pretty much get retconned in future installments of the MCU. I think this is a film that they just told Shane Black, who is a fantastic director and writer. I love Shane Black. Again, like Kiss Kiss Bang Bang is one of my favorite films of all time. But I feel like they told Shane Black to just do whatever he wanted, and he did whatever he wanted, and then Kevin Feige was like, oh crap, we shouldn't have let him do that. So then they just retconned a lot of the stuff from this film. That's kind of what it feels like. And again, I think because of that, it makes a pretty solid film on its own right. Like, it feels like a really fun take on Iron Man from Shane Black, which is great. But as part of the MCU, it's very tough to rank because it's not really part of the MCU. It doesn't really feel like part of the MCU. I put it here at 14, so there we go. At number 13 is a movie that I feel like I never liked as much as other people. I know so many people love this film. It's one of their favorite MCU films. For me, I just always found it pretty middle of the road. And for me, that's Thor Ragnarok. And don't get me wrong, I like this movie. I think it's a really fun movie. Probably the funniest MCU film, or at least one of the funniest MCU films. Definitely a different type of humor, though, than what we're used to from the MCU. It's not the same type of humor you would get from like a Guardians film or Ant-Man or even the previous Thor movies. It just feels like it has its own type of comedy. And because of that, it does also feel a bit disconnected from the previous Thor films. It does make Thor feel like a pretty different character from the previous ones, where he's a lot more humorous, obviously, here. I feel like because of that, it does kind of throw me off a bit, but it's still a really fun movie. I mean, it introduces a lot of fun characters. You get to see Hulk in the Planet Hulk sort of storyline. That's really fun. Pretty dark film as well, where like Thor loses Asgard, which obviously sets up the beginning of Infinity War, where eventually he loses Loki and all that stuff, and that's kind of where he becomes really depressed and all that. Obviously, we get the introduction to like Korg and to Valkyrie, and like, I mean, this movie definitely has some stuff that's really fun about it. It's a great Taika Waititi film, but again, being honest, it just never really personally connected for me. So for me, it lands here at number 13. At number 12 is a movie I really debated on. This is one that used to actually be a bit lower on the list. However, after my latest rewatch, I really enjoyed the movie a lot more and decided to bump it up. And at number 12 here, I have Black Panther. It's a movie that I do find, to be honest, kind of boring at points. I never personally found this film to be the most dynamic film in the series, not one that really held my attention the entire way through, but it's a film I do have a lot of respect for. I do think the performances are really strong. I think Michael B. Jordan's great as Killmonger, again, one of the best villains in the MCU. I think Chadwick Boseman as Black Panther is obviously fantastic as well. There's a lot of really great performances within this movie. I also think thematically, it's one of the most realized films in the series. I think that's really great as well. It is a really great film. Overall, obviously, it is directed by Ryan Coogler, who is one of the best directors working today. Again, like, there's so much great within this film. But again, for me, I did find it kind of boring at points. But on the rewatch, again, I respected a lot more things about it. I mean, I think the characters' portrayals, again, really good. There are things I really like about it. There are things that I just kind of feel about. So it's a pretty mixed bag for me. But it is a film that I do have a lot of respect for. And because of that, I decided to put it here at number 12. At number 11 is a movie that I just find to be pretty fun. I've talked about it before. We'll talk about it here. It's Ant-Man. Again, I like Ant-Man as a character. I think he brings a lot of humor to the series. I think it's a lot of fun. Him and Michael Pena is really great in this film as well. I feel like this is a very focused film. That was kind of one of my issues with Ant-Man and the Wasp as well, is I felt like it kind of went all over the place at points. I feel like the first Ant-Man here is very focused, has a set narrative that it tries to tell, executes it pretty well. I don't think the villain is that great. I mean, he's kind of just fine, but it's like outside that, I think there's a lot of great acting between the main cast. I think the short appearance from Falcon's really great as well. Yeah, I really like Ant-Man as a character. I feel like this is a pretty solid introduction to him. It ranks here at number 11. Now, number 10, we have the film that started it all. We have the first Iron Man. And the thing about this movie is this is another one. When I first watched it when I was a kid, I didn't love it. I mean, I found it pretty boring after he's able to escape from the cave and everything. Like, I thought that beginning section was really fun when I was younger. After that, I just felt like it kind of dragged. In retrospect, I really like the entire film. I think it's a great movie. I think it does a pretty good job in starting the franchise as a whole. It does kind of feel a bit disconnected from the rest of the movies. They were solely focusing on telling this origin story of Iron Man, and again, I think they execute it very well. Obviously, Robert Downey Jr. is fantastic as Tony Stark. It is overall a great movie, and the film that started it all, it lands here at number 10. Now, number 9, we have a movie that I probably have ranked a bit higher than most other people. I know a lot of people find this movie to be pretty disappointing, but I personally enjoyed it, and that is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Spoiler, obviously we haven't talked about Guardians of the Galaxy 1 yet, but I really love the Guardians of the Galaxy, and Guardians of the Galaxy 2 is just more of the Guardians of the Galaxy. I do think it does suffer the same fate as like some of these other sequels where it tries to just kind of imitate the first film, and I think because that it does come off as like kind of a weaker version of that. But I do like a lot of the story beats within this. I do like that Peter Quill's father is Ego, and how Ego is played by Kurt Russell. I think that's fantastic. Obviously, the death of Yondu in this movie is a really great scene as well. Obviously, just more interactions between the Guardians is really fun. Introduction of Mantis is really great. I think this is a fun movie. I mean, it's a fun movie as a whole. So Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 here, really enjoyed it. It lands here at number 9. At number 8, I have another film that I'm pretty sure I have ranked much higher than a lot of other people, but this is a film that I've loved ever since I first watched it. It's a film I have a lot of respect for, and that is Thor. And Thor is a perfect example of a hero's journey narrative in film. I feel like it's the type of movie that, like, if you've read Joseph Campbell's work, if you know about the hero's journey, I think Thor is a perfect representation of that. And as someone who has studied the works of Joseph Campbell in the past, I did really enjoy Thor because of that. I also just like Thor as a character. I really like the scenes where Thor is just out of his element. I think those scenes are really fun. Obviously, this gives us the introduction to Loki, who is again one of the greatest villains in the history of the series. It's just overall a solid movie, and it is one of the movies in the MCU that I have watched the most, and obviously that does play a factor here. That is one of the reasons why it is ranked as high as it is, but again, it's my personal list, so screw it. It's here at number 8. Now at number 7, we have another movie that is probably a lot higher on my list than it is on others. I know this is a movie that a lot of people didn't like when it initially came out, and I was kind of middle of the road on it, but I think in my rewatches now, especially after having watched Infinity War and Endgame, it's a movie I have so much more respect for, and that is Age of Ultron. And Age of Ultron, obviously the second Avengers film, and it is really impressive when you rewatch this movie just to see how much foreshadowing there is here to future installments in the franchise. Like, you just see just how much stuff from this movie was later utilized in films like Infinity War and Endgame. But then also, I just feel like it's a fine movie. It's kind of a darker take on the Avengers. Obviously, it does get darker from here with Infinity War, but it does set up, obviously, Civil War. We do get to see these interactions with, obviously, Tony Stark, Steve Rogers. But it's kind of also weird when you think about it that Tony Stark and Steve Rogers, this is the last time that they're like working together until Endgame. And also, this is the last time that you see them together with like Thor and Hulk, and it's just a really weird thing when you really think about how many movies took place in between that period. I think Ultron himself is a fine villain. I mean, not one of the best the series has ever had, but he's fine. I think he was portrayed very well by James Spader. But overall, again, I just think this is a pretty fun movie, and again, I think the connection that this movie has to the others in the series. Obviously, it also introduces Vision, introduces Scarlet Witch. That's also major impacts on the series. Obviously, through Vision also comes the Mind Stone. So again, this movie does a lot of setup for future installments in the series, and because that it is a film I have a lot of respect for, it lands here at number 7. Now, at number 6, we have a movie that, again, is another one that I've seen people rank at number 1 or 2. For me, I really enjoy it. And that is Captain America, the Winter Soldier. And this is another one that when I first watched it, I was just kind of okay on. In the rewatches, though, it's a really fun movie. It's a great, like, sort of spy movie within the MCU and, like, kind of political thriller within the MCU. It was great to get a Captain America here in the modern day, where obviously before this we had the first Avenger back in World War II. Here we get in the modern day, and I really love how they interconnect the two storylines, where obviously we get the introduction of the Winter Soldier, obviously Bucky Barnes, and all that history that we have with that character. That's really fun here. We get to see more interactions between Captain America and Black Widow. That's really great. We get the introduction of Falcon. That's pretty fun. Again, it's an all-around just really great movie. It's well written, well acted, well directed by the Russos. And again, I think kind of obviously the first proof that the Russos know what they're doing when it comes to MCU, considering, spoiler alert, 4 out of my top 6 movies are movies directed by the Russo brothers. So again, Winter Soldier, really great movie, lands here at number 6. Now number 5 is a movie that for the longest time was actually my number 1. This was a movie that at one point I even debated like considering it my favorite movie of all time. I think that's kind of a ridiculous statement at this point, but it's still a movie I do really enjoy, and that is the Avengers, the first one. And I don't know, it's a great movie. Again, it's really, at the time, it was just a really great thing to see Tony Stark, Captain America, Hulk, Thor, Black Widow, and I guess you can throw in Hawkeye in there, like all together in one movie. Like that was just so great to see. Like the lead up from Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America to this film was fantastic. See all these storylines come together, to see Loki and the Tesseract and all these other plot lines from previous films come together here in the Avengers was incredible. And now we kind of take it for granted. Obviously, we've had things like Infinity War and Endgame, which are much bigger spectacles, and even like Civil War. I know I'm spoiling the future films on my list, but whatever. Those are more impressive spectacles nowadays, but still, for the time, Avengers was incredible. It's still a really fun movie now. It's a really rewatchable movie. It's one of these movies that I could just watch at any time and still have a lot of fun with it. Again, obviously, really fun movie, lands here at number 5. Now at number 4, we have another movie that's just so rewatchable for me. Again, another movie that I can put on at any time, have a lot of fun with it, and that is Guardians of the Galaxy, the first one. And kind of just more of the same of what I said about Volume 2, but even better here. I think the humor in this film is fantastic. I think this is probably, to me, the funniest MCU film. I really love the characters of the Guardians of the Galaxy. I think they're all portrayed very well. They're all great here. I think their storylines are really interesting. Their connection to Thanos, which obviously plays a much bigger factor in later films, is really fun as well. For me, it's just a really fun movie. It's a movie that I have pretty well memorized in my head. Like I can remember like scene for scene the structure of this movie. And again, I think it's just a great setup for future plot lines that we'll eventually get that are more important in like Infinity War and Endgame. And because of that, ranks here at number 4. Now number 3, and I kind of spoiled this earlier, but so essentially my top 3 are all Russo films, which I think is a testament to the Russo brothers' skill in making MCU films, but also a testament to the films that they actually made. And here at number 3, we have Captain America, Civil War, which also, spoiler, this is the last non-Avengers film. So that's something. But I mean, Civil War is pretty much an Avengers movie, right? It's essentially Avengers 2.5. Like, it's kind of the most important non-Avengers film. And again, Civil War is great. I mean, Civil War is something that I will be completely honest, I was kind of let down by when I first watched it, in the sense that I was kind of expecting a bigger spectacle of a fight. Obviously, the airport scene is fantastic. It is a great fight sequence. See all these superheroes that we obviously know and love at that point to be fighting each other. It's fantastic. See them all utilize their powers in the way that they do. It's really great. However, I don't know, when I imagined like Civil War, I was expecting essentially what we got from like Endgame, like that scale of a fight. But instead it was more of on a smaller scale, but it was still really fun. And also see this dynamic between Tony Stark and Captain America is really great here, how they were fighting over the Sokovia Accords, which obviously was a storyline that carries over from Age of Ultron. We also get the introduction of Spider-Man and Black Panther in this movie. And overall, it's just a really great film. I really love like everything Captain America does in this movie, where he obviously protects Bucky Barnes, his friend from when he was back in World War II, but then also has this conflict with his friendship with Tony Stark. And also, we also get more background on Tony Stark's character with showing the death of his parents and all that stuff. That stuff's really great too. So mixing that in with all the great fight sequences and everything, it is a fantastic film. I think the only downside is that the villain is pretty terrible, but outside of that, it's a great film with some really memorable scenes. It lands here at number 3. Now at number 2. So, I mean, obviously, if you can't tell, number 1 and number 2 are obviously Infinity War and Endgame. Question is, which one's number 1? I mean, I think these are two of my favorite films really ever. Like, not even just within the MCU, but in the history of film. Like, both these films just really stick out to my mind as using previous continuities to make masterful stories and masterful conclusions to prolonged story arcs. And that's something I do find very impressive about both these films. But let's just get to it. Number 2 on my ranking here, I have Avengers Endgame. And I loved Endgame. I think Endgame is, again, it's one of my all-time favorite films. As I said, both of these are 2 of my all-time favorite films. Endgame is fantastic, and it is the conclusion to everything so far. It's the conclusion to the main storyline of the MCU so far, the end of Tony Stark's story, the end of Captain America's story, and both of them are given really great send-offs. I mean, I do have some problems with Captain America's storyline in terms of plot holes, but I already talked about that in my Avengers Endgame review, which you can find on this channel somewhere. But I thought the way they killed off Tony Stark, really fantastic. I think him snapping right after saying I am Iron Man, great scene. The entire fight sequence is incredible. That end fight sequence where everyone appears from the portals and get that massive war that I've been wanting for so long in the MCU. That was fantastic. Thanos is obviously a great villain. The fight with Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor versus Thanos, that's probably my favorite fight scene in the history of the series. It's just so great, especially when Captain America grabs Mjolnir and starts beating Thanos with it. That's such a fantastic scene as well. Even that's getting ahead of myself. I mean, we even have all the time travel stuff where they go back to the previous films to get all the Infinity Stones. That's such a fantastic way to execute this final installment in the series of revisiting scenes from the Avengers, from Thor: The Dark World, from the first Guardians of the Galaxy. All that is fantastic. To have Tony Stark come face to face with his father and have that fantastic conversation about fatherhood was really great. Obviously, just Tony Stark being a father, I think that all that stuff was really heartwarming as well. This is just a great movie. It really is. Like, it's one of my all-time favorite films. I really can't say anything bad about it. I mean, the only thing why Avengers Endgame is number 2 here is just because I feel like Infinity War is better. Like, there's nothing bad about Endgame. It's just the other one is better. So for me, Endgame lands here at number 2. And obviously here for number 1, I already spoiled it. Number 1 is Infinity War. And Infinity War is just incredible. It really is to me. I mean, like, Infinity War is everything I want from an MCU film. I've talked about this before, how in storytelling, my favorite stories are when the heroes lose. Obviously, they lose against Thanos. They lose half of the population. They lose all the Infinity Stones. Most of them lose in a one-on-one fight with Thanos. Like, it is a dark film. It's a film that doesn't end with the heroes winning, and I think that's an element of why I love it. It's also the start of the culmination of the series, where we start getting all these plot lines coming together, all these characters coming together. We get Thor and the Guardians of the Galaxy. That was really great. We get Tony Stark teaming up with Doctor Strange. That was really fun. Captain America teaming up with like Black Panther and some of these other characters. Like, all this stuff is so fantastic. It really, really is. But one of the major things about this film that I really do love, that really puts it over the top for me, is the story of Thanos and him getting all these Infinity Stones throughout this film, all to achieve this goal that is rationalized to the audience. I think Thanos is one of the most complex characters in the MCU, and I think he's one of the best villains in the MCU. I mean, no, he is the best villain in the MCU. It's not even a question. And really, Infinity War, if you really want to think about it, it is Thanos' movie. It is a Thanos movie, more so than it is Avengers movie, where Thanos is kind of the hero of this story, where Thanos goes out, achieves his goal, and succeeds at the end. While the traditional heroes, the Avengers, the ones that we're supposed to be rooting for, the ones that do eventually succeed in the next installment of the series, they all lose. And I really love that dynamic from this film. That, with all the mixing of all the characters and storylines from previous films, really puts this one over the top. For me, it's easily my favorite film in the series, and to be honest, quite possibly is one of my favorite films of all time. Like, it's definitely up there. I might do a video on my favorite movies of all time at some point, and Infinity War will definitely be on that list. So there we go. That is my ranking of every film in the MCU up to this point, which again, we are starting phase 4 very soon now. Black Widow is going to come out. We'll see how that goes, but I thought this was a good time to stop and do this ranking now that we're done with the Infinity Saga. Kind of a solid group of films to rank here. And yeah, hope you enjoyed. So yeah, that is the video. That is my ranking of the films in the MCU. Thank you for watching.